Today, I want to answer the question, do I have to charge interest on a land contract? Well, by the end of this video, you're going to have a clear understanding whether charging interest on a land contract is actually a legal requirement, how it affects your investment returns, and strategies to maximize your revenue while staying compliant with the law. This insight could be a game changer for your real estate investing strategy. Have you ever wondered if you can offer a land contract without charging any interest in hopes to close the deal faster? Or have you ever been curious about if you change your interest or don't change it, if it could have an impact on how it could save you on taxes? Well, stick around as I answer those questions by first explaining the key components within a land contract. I then want to help you understand both the buyer and the seller's mindset when it comes to a land contract. And finally, explain to you the pros and cons of charging interest or not when it comes to a land contract. If you're ready, let's go. A land contract is a legal agreement on a seller finance purchase that is negotiated between buyer and seller, and all the key components are negotiated between buyer and seller. And where it's not a traditional mortgage, it can get done so much faster. However, the seller retains deed and title of the property until the buyer pays that land contract in full. So what are the key components of a land contract? Well, first off, it's the purchase price of the home, right? Buyer and seller are going to agree on that. They'll also agree on interest rate, if there is one charged, and if there is one charged, how much is the interest rate? They'll also agree upon a down payment, if there's one of those as well, or closing costs, and then the monthly payment, and at what cadence that monthly payment is paid. And I'd also recommend within that there's some contingencies, right? Because if you are the buyer in a land contract, and if you miss a payment, or if you're late on a payment, there could be grounds for the seller to evict you from the property and keep all the money you put into it. So having a contingency that says if the payment is late, this is how it's rectified, or if I miss a payment, this is how it's rectified. So contingencies surrounding payments is crucial. Also, an amount and a due date of a balloon payment, if that's something that's negotiated. Equitable title for the buyer, right? As I mentioned, the buyer doesn't have title or hold the deed, but he can hold equitable title, which this will help you to make sure that the seller can't resell the property or there aren't liens or encumbrances upon the property that might surprise you down the road. You're going to want the component of assurances to make sure there's no taxes owed or any liens on the property. And finally, who is responsible for what? Who's going to do the maintenance, the repairs, the taxes, insurance? Typically that falls on the buyer, but that can also be negotiated. So when is a land contract typically used? Well, from the buyer's side, a land contract is something where a buyer can actually get into a home, own a home, right? Equitable title to that home without going through a traditional mortgage. Meaning that they've had some challenges in the past where they can't get a loan. Maybe they've had a short sale or a foreclosure on their record. Maybe you don't have enough money for a down payment or closing costs, or maybe your credit history just isn't that good, or you haven't built up credit enough to do that. Those are all reasons why a buyer might utilize a land contract. From the seller's side, the second you say, I am doing a seller finance on this property, you open the doors to a much larger buyer pool, because there are some buyers who can't get a traditional loan, and saying that you're willing to seller finance it through a land contract could really open that door. Another advantage for the seller is the fact that they can charge a higher interest rate if they wanted to, because you're dealing with a buyer who's not necessarily credit worthy. That could be a way for the buyer to make additional money, even if they've already got a mortgage in place. Let's say the seller has a mortgage. You can still do a land contract with the mortgage, but the seller needs to take that money, that payment they receive from the buyer every month, and it's what's called a wraparound mortgage, where they'll wrap around and pay the mortgage company and pocket what's left over. So what are the pros and cons for both the buyer and seller? What does their mindset look like when they engage into a land contract? Well, from the buyer's side, let's look at some of the pros. Obviously, they're getting into a home that they might not have to put down any down payment, very little closing costs, and maybe a little interest rate, depending on what they and the seller negotiate. And the other advantage is the buyer gets to enjoy the home. It's their home, and they don't have to go through the hassle of working with a bank. Some of the negatives or cons to the buyer is that they don't build up a ton of equity in the home through a land contract. They don't build their credit. A lot of times the sellers don't report them making payments on time to the credit agencies. If a buyer can't make payments, or they miss a balloon payment, or they default on the land contract, they could lose the entire property and all the money they've paid up to that point. So some of the benefits to the seller, and probably the biggest one, is that they can act as a landlord without any of the landlord responsibilities. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, number one, as a landlord, they don't have to worry about maintenance, repairs, insurance, taxes, none of that, right? That all falls on the buyer. However, if the buyer defaults on the land contract, the seller can act as a landlord and evict the person from the property and not go through a foreclosure process. This is why land contracts are super beneficial and they favor the seller. The negative for a seller is that they are dealing with somebody who's maybe not as credit worthy as somebody who is buying the home outright. Now, here's my thought on charging interest with a land contract. My thought is you would always charge interest in a land contract, and you would even charge a little bit higher than the going rate because you are taking a risk as a seller. Now, scenarios where you might not charge any interest in a land contract might fall under the umbrella that you're dealing with a family member or a close friend that you're trying to get them into a property, and they can't get into a property with a traditional bank. And so to help them save money, you are not charging any interest rate at all, allowing them to essentially rent the home with an equitable title that when they do get that loan with the bank, it then becomes theirs. But everything follows the guidelines under the laws. And one thing I'll say when it comes to land contracts, they are so different in each state and sometimes between counties, municipalities, that I would recommend working and dealing with a real estate attorney who has some experience with land contracts. And land contracts are a great tool for a real estate strategy called a slow flip. But I'll tell you what, I have developed a strategy that is similar to a slow flip, but flips it on its head, that anybody can do in any market with little to no money out of your pocket. It's called cash flow flipping. And it is an amazing strategy that anybody can do to build wealth. And if you want to know exactly how I came up with the strategy to the point where you can start doing it immediately, watch this video where I walk you through step by step on how to do cash flow flipping with little to no money out of your pocket. Thanks for stopping by. Have an amazing day.